Merci à tout le monde d'être ici. Just to give you a brief sort of synopsis on how these exchanges have been going. The first part for the first half or so, 20-25 minutes, is with our invited speaker this week or this exchange. It's Lace Brogdon, who I'll introduce in a moment. And then really during that time, we encourage you to listen, welcome questions in the chat. But at that point, it's really about reflecting and listening related to the theme of the exchange itself. Then halfway or so, we'll open the format to question and answer and bring you all into the exchange for your questions. So it's really about listening and thinking together to push our thinking further on the issue. That's really one of our main goals, is to think outside of maybe what your other previous tendencies have been around these topics. It is also, of course, a choice for you to voice a question you've been asking yourself maybe for a long time, or perhaps as a result of the exchange itself and the discussion that we're having right now. So Micah and I are thrilled to welcome Dr. Lace Brogdon, who has worn many different hats. I'm going to let Lace introduce herself in her own way later, whatever she feels, but I wanted to highlight the different hats that she's worn, and that really motivated us to ask her to come and be with us today. In FSL education, Lace has been a French immersion teacher. She's worked for the Ministry of Education as a representative doing curriculum development. She is a full professor. She's been the director of the Bac en Éducation Française at Laurentian, and she is now the Dean of Education. She has been Dean of Education at 2 institutions, so this is her second round, I suppose, of many, hopefully, in terms of, or just staying where you are. But this, you in this leadership position certainly speaks to resources, human and material, in terms of FSL teacher education. And of course, she's at present the president of the Association of Canadian Deans of Education, so has a good idea of perhaps FSL-related issues and things going on at other faculties of education. Alors, elle est extrêmement bien positionnée pour contribuer à cette discussion. I also want to mention that Lace and I will sort of be going back and forth, French and English, as it comes, and chat, questions and contributions, les questions à l'oral sont accueillies en français ou en anglais, c'est à vous de décider. Alors, la première question, ce sont les mêmes questions qui ont guidé les autres échanges. How are you thinking about this gap itself? So gap 3 is really about I want to say lack in quotes, or I'm intrigued to hear what you have to say about not only material resources, which has been a common discussion in FSL, but human resources, which is coming to the fray.
So, merci, Stephanie. I would like to start by acknowledging that I am coming to you today from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I live in Megadowik, which is known as the place of the big eels. And I encourage each of us to continue and to engage with Indigenous ways of knowing and thinking about what it means for the places that we occupy, and the stories that have preceded us. So with that, number one, the big gap. First, I thought, oh, you don't want to talk about resources again. How could we talk about resources again? How, after all of these years, could we still be talking about the gap in resources? Stephanie, when you go through my little abridged CV there, I just think, oh, she's been around for a while. Maybe that's too long. And apologies, I've been traveling, so my voice is a little bit off. I think quand j'ai lu les points sommaires pour cette thématique, il y a 2 choses qui m'ont vraiment frappé. La première, c'est que nous sommes toujours en train d'avoir cette discussion. Et finalement, pendant longtemps, j'ai dit, OK, arrêtons de dire qu'il n'y a pas de ressources en français, parce qu'il suffit de chercher. Mais maintenant, en voyant le travail que vous avez fait, je pense que je dois me questionner par rapport à cette philosophie, justement parce que les enseignants, maintenant, ont tellement plus de défis au quotidien que ce que j'avais vécu moi comme enseignante en immersion française, disons. Et aussi, je crains qu'ils ont moins d'outils avant. I know that sounds bizarre. What I really think is super interesting with the way you've presented it is this element of adding in not just the material resources, but the human resources. Because what struck me in particular in your report or in comments from some of the teachers are some of the things that were available to us regularly as, teachers, I'll say a really long time ago, were things like a dedicated French immersion consultant at our board office, a dedicated French core French person at our board office was different from the person I just mentioned. And so I've noticed an erosion of a lot of these positions, or at the ministerial level, I've been noticing that a position will be lost. And so we'll just take those other files et on va juste les ajouter. Hein. On va empiler ça. Et du coup, la personne a ça de temps pour gérer le dossier du français langue seconde. So I do think that the human resource question might actually be a way to get us sort of back to that material reality of day to day for initial teacher education and for in-service teaching, where really it's like, what am I doing in the face of the right now? So the human resource piece, I really, really like it. J'ai trouvé drôle qu'il y a des commentaires que j'ai mis dans ma maîtrise de 1900, vous ne voulez pas savoir, à savoir qu'il n'y a pas suffisamment d'appui administratif en français, que ça soit au sein du département de ressources humaines, que ça soit au sein de l'école, que ça soit la décision administrative qui est prise par rapport à la pause pour l'assistante. Ça m'a beaucoup frappé. Donc, nous sommes en train de continuer à prendre ces décisions d'une perspective majoritaire à l'intérieur d'un système majoritaire où le français se voit toujours marginalisé. And so even if we have a good fortune, let's say an immersion to be in a single track school, we're still sitting inside of this majority system from a human resources perspective. I could go on, but let's do that for now.
Yeah, no, I have one thing that your comments made me think of is your recent experience in faculties of education. Is there, because a lot of, as you saw from the research that sort of is inspiring these exchanges, this idea of they're new teachers and they're speaking about material and human resources as they are entering, and then they also speak retrospectively at the Faculty of Education. That's something that struck me in terms of the resources and to what extent faculties might be reproducing, might be a strong word, but producing those things right from when they enter teacher education, and then it gets reinforced once they go in the field. Do you have any commentary or observations around that?
Right, I do actually. So too bad this is being recorded. It's just going to be out there on the web, but people who have known me for a long time just know that I'm just going to say it and we'll live with the consequences. I have to say, for those who, some of the people in the call have known me for a really long time. Salut, Andrea. And so what's interesting to me now is that 2.5 years ago, I made this decision to stop working in French every day and to come to my first gig in English. My first paid employment in English in my career. That's now more than 30 years in length. And I have to keep working for a really long time still. So I've come face to face with what a lot of people have been dealing with for a long time, and being that little teeny tiny fish in a big Anglophone pond. And I do think that in faculties of education, we also need to sort of step up with our responsibilities. We have a few places that are doing it really well, that have had French, vraiment ancré à l'intérieur du système pendant longtemps. My time at the University of Regina, which is where I was director of the back, just a little correction there. But I think that, universities are also doing this budgetary pressure exercise. That means that we're re-arguing for things that we thought we argued for as an extension of Article 23 20 years ago. So I feel as though sometimes we're taking those arguments back up, and we thought, oh, I thought I had this argument. Like, I thought my boss had this argument 25 years ago. I thought that on a eu ces gains là, on croyait avoir atteint quelque chose. Et là, on est en train de retravailler ces mêmes arguments. Because inevitably in a faculty of education, and especially I will say in Anglophone faculty of education, but even in faculties where sort of like, let's say they take the University of Regina, where you do have some dedicated funding for French teacher education. In either of those cases, French teacher education doesn't break even. We just don't have the critical mass for French teacher education.
Mm-mm.
And so as soon as we have anything offered in teacher education that doesn't break even, the first question is, well, why are we offering it? Do we need to
Yeah.
offer it? How do you get more students? Well, what are you doing? Just want me to produce some bilingual graduates of an undergrad degree and just have them come. So that I think is a piece to respond to your thing about the faculties, that we really need to continue as faculties to be advocates. And we have people who want to advocate with us. A few weeks ago here at St. FX, we had the Consulat Général de la France au Canada. We had some reps on campus to just, create that excitement and that energy and that exchange and think about how we might move forward with teeny tiny little, I wouldn't even say a pot of money, like a little envelope, teeny tiny envelope of maybe some quelques petits sous that we could move forward with just a few initiatives, providing students with opportunities so that they see French in their future. I know everyone on the call already knows this because I see the names. I know so many of you. And I think we're still, when we think about resources, when we think about accomplishments and outcomes, we think, how can we encourage more bilingualism within the system so that as we feed initial teacher education and as we nourish in-service professional development, we have people, we have the bodies, the human resource bodies that we need in the system to keep the system thriving or return it to thriving in places where it maybe isn't thriving.
Mm-hmm. And so with that in mind and those sort of that thinking being it's pushed to the point of, maybe our energy, let's call it, should be directed in a different or not abandoning something else for something else, but sort of sharing, as you say, I liked your idea of merging sort of the material and human resources advocacy that we do. But quels sont nos obstacles? Like what obstacles, what's in the way? And maybe where in particular do we need to push in the short term? I say short term, long term, but the general question is, where do we need to push in general, in your opinion?
Une bonne question. So I think one of the places to be persistently polite is in perhaps reminding our sometimes unilingual colleagues or sometimes people who have a lot of other priorities in their portfolio, reminding them of some of the sort of judiciary relevance of French in Canada. And this is a tricky piece because as institutions, whether they are schools or universities or governments or even businesses, are really focusing in on EDI and EDIA, EDID. One of the things that's happening is that the French, la cause francophone, si on veut, que la cause ne peut pas se mettre en avant d'une autre cause. Donc, c'est une nouvelle négociation, là. Il faut réaliser que on n'est pas là aux Olympiques de l'oppression. Il faut tout simplement expliquer son cas, ne pas trop imposer sur les autres cas, n'est-ce pas? Et puis aller de l'avant avec les droits et les responsabilités. So sometimes I find myself giving little Article 23 lessons to, say, vice presidents. Sometimes I find myself encouraging decision makers are like, oh, you're the dean, you're a decision maker. You'd be surprised. Encouraging decision makers to think about how it can benefit us, that we're promoting resources for French, human resources for French, material resources for French, the programs themselves. I think I didn't realize when I started my career that my passion for French needed also to be advocacy for French. Is that how I love French? Everyone's going to love French as much as I love French. This will be grand. This will be grand. As we say in Nova Scotia, it'll be grand. Okay, so it's not always grand. And so to leverage our passion and our beliefs and share those in ways that help others to imagine what it is that we're advocating for. Does that make sense? I see a
Oh,
question
yeah.
forming, Stephanie.
No, I don't want to move to, well, I do,
We can dwell here for a minute.
I think there's been a lot of advocacy around material resources. And one of the
Mhm.
things I wanted to, it's not necessarily a confirmation of, um, it's an anecdotal, but I wonder to what extent you and others maybe later want to discuss from a research perspective, figuring if this is the case. It kind of reminds me of what Callie said the last time in terms of why are teachers not accessing what is accessible? So there's been a lot of work, I think, by a lot of associations like CASLT FSL on material resource development, and those are still coming up. So I feel like that's a different question as to why they aren't finding them. They're not, oh, like I don't, I that's one in my mind to explore in terms of a research or a path to inquiry around that. It's not that they don't exist. Whereas the human resource element, like you're saying, is maybe they might not exist as obviously, but maybe we have to reframe what we mean by a human resource for FSL. It could be someone around advocacy, a really energized and passionate parent. It need
Mhm.
not be somebody with high qualifications or high status or high, as you say, decision-making power. It's just that was my thought when you said that. I thought, okay, if we
Yeah.
reframe what a human resource is, that
So
could be something to look at.
that's a thing. What are our relationships with, say, CPF? They're still going strong. They still want to be doing good work, and they have a different voice. And I would argue that in this current context, from a voter perspective, sometimes their voices are stronger than the academic voice.
Mm,
The populist sort of political culture that we're in means that our positional power as researchers is diminished. The fact that we researched it and it was sound research, est plus ou moins pertinent
oui.
dans un système où on va juste chercher le vote. So, not to be pessimistic, but to
Mm,
recognize that, yeah, like you're saying, Stephanie, we do have people we can reach out to. And sometimes those people are hiding out in the civil service and they want to do good work.
mm,
If I may share an example, right here in Nova Scotia, I was approached last spring. Lace Marie, on sait que tu appuies l'enseignement du français, c'est super. On aimerait faire un petit projet pilote de mentorat collectif. So here you have two people working in the government qui sont de moyenne haleine au gouvernement. Donc, question de pouvoir faire du beau travail puis survivre le système, hein? Mais avec un dévouement à la cause francophone. Fantastique. So I said, yes, St. FX would love to host this as long as you invite some of my students. So we have this project going, and I'll say 11 people. And you'll say 11 teachers? That's it? 11? Yes, 11 teachers this weekend will be giving up their second in person weekend, their third virtual weekend, giving up, spending, investing in whichever language and frame you want to come to. And they will be coming to St. FX and they'll be working with the government people. And a couple of them are my students because our students our pre-service teachers were invited to participate if they wish to participate fully. They'll be getting gift resources that the budget magically appeared for that didn't exist, resources that because it's good to have few tangible things. And I've watched this, and we went to Pomquette, and we had a cultural experience the first weekend. And I've watched this group coalesce. It really is du mentorat collectif. C'est pas, bon, voici la tête parlante qui vous dit quoi faire. C'est vraiment les enseignants qui avaient besoin d'un réseautage, OK? Et en les mettant ensemble et en alimentant leur discussion, en alimentant ce qu'ils savent déjà, là, ils sont en train de s'épanouir, d'avoir un renouvellement pour l'enseignement en français dans leur propre salle de classe, d'essayer de nouvelles choses, d'avoir une personne ressource quand ils ont de la difficulté avec X, Y ou Z, technologie, peu importe. Et peut-être retourne à un réseautage comme ça pour qu'il y ait des gens qui puissent se voir avoir du succès dans leur salle de classe. It's not a good sentence, sorry. I was thinking about 7 things. So, avoir du succès dans leur propre salle de classe et réallumer la passion qu'ils ont pour l'enseignement en français. And by extension, then their kids are happier, the parents are
That's
happier, the
exactly
parents
what
are
I was
saying
just
good.
about to
So what you're
say.
going to say,
Passion
right?
spreads, right?
The
Like
passion
that.
spreads.
Yeah. And
But
it's
you,
a not a no cost, but it definitely is not necessarily banking on financial.
it isn't. But this is something that didn't exist 2 years ago until someone like me makes connections with people at the ministry who are, I won't say hiding out in their office. They're doing tons of good work. They have so many ideas. And so in this
Mm,
case, I'm sort of the advocate for them to say, oh, well, both St. FX wants to partner for us with us. They're they're partnering with me. I'm saying, well, the ministry wants to partner with St. FX. And
mhm.
so from there, the teachers and the pre-service teachers are the ones who are benefiting. So I think to look for our advocates, whether parents, who they are, different groups, like you've mentioned, ACP as well, um, the different groups, and how can these groups advocate as for us, and how can we as researchers promote that advocacy or document the advocacy in more than just me telling you about this really great project,
So
right?
would you say that's a
Over.
question that researchers should be asking? Let's segue to the third question.
Yeah, let's segue. And if I had to do it over, I would have run to the REB, right?
The
I'm the
ethics
dean. I
board.
didn't see
Yeah.
myself being so implicated, but it's just too good of a project and I have to be there. That's just, it's where limited human resources, a small university, small campus, small town. And so I'm there. But I mean, ideally, if we do it again, then I'll spend the spring getting a faculty member to get the REB through so that we can research it and document it and say, I'm a big believer in qualitative research. I've done the quantitative thing. I'm also a big believer in qualitative. And I think these qualitative stories and pieces are an opportunity for us in research to move. If we have 1,000 qualitative stories that say that learning French in public schools is fabulous, that adds up to a quantitative study. I'm sure I learned that in my master's.
Est-ce qu'il y
So,
a d'autres questions que les chercheurs devraient poser?
yeah.
Yes.
I do think there's some interesting questions that need to be posed delicately right now around um, the funding trends in education, including towards the research of the education. Um, where does research about French learning contexts fit into the Tri-Council envelopes, for example?
Mm.
Um, is the call for is the promotion right now of interdisciplinary research helping us en français? Is it diverting previously available funds for French language education research to other sort of more generalist areas? I don't know the answer. You said what areas do we need to research?
Mhm.
I'm throwing them out
No,
there.
that's a question. It's not only areas, it's the question. That's a question that is worth
Yeah, that's the question.
gathering data. Yeah.
Another thing I'm very interested in, right now, I know that our university and a lot of universities within the envelope are having quite a bit of success with the SHORK partnership grant. The partnership engagement grant, it seems to be an accessible fund, at least for smaller universities with terrific researchers like my faculty.
Mhm.
Are we accessing that for French language? And when we access it, are we reaching out as researchers to find out the key questions that our partners want answered or need answered? What are the political pressures? It's interesting. Okay, so some researchers somewhere in Canada were distressed a few weeks ago because a government somewhere was trying to tie research and operating funding to the types of research that they were going to do. Well, this is government interference and we can't have this and this is inappropriate because none of us has ever accepted a research grant from an interested party. Well, yes, we do. It gets a little worrisome when it's from the government, granted, but our partners have really great problems. They have really great challenges. And so as researchers, if we can see a path to some key seed funding that will help us move our partners' challenges forward. I think when we think about the questions, I want to know, I want these pre-service teachers who answered your research. Each one of those is a jumping off point as far as I can tell. I want to know I go back to that example of the EAs.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if the EA gets to have their break during French, well, that's the number one clue that none of the AAs speak French. So there's a challenge, which is a human resource challenge.
Yes.
And then what are the decisions, the administrative decisions that are driving the support of programming in schools? Sometimes we need to ask a majority question to facilitate our minority cause. If we ask a question that the majority cares about, and then we add en français at the end, sometimes we can get a little further. And I'm not saying that we don't still ask. Il faut toujours avoir des questions qui sont très spécifiques au contexte de l'apprentissage de la langue française, de l'enseignement en français. Ça, c'est très important. Et il faut continuer cela, je crois. I think another research area, and then if I'm talking just, I have 2 minutes, it says, Stephanie, before we open it up.
Yeah, hey.
I think another research area is I continue to hear other countries still want to look at Canada because we do all this great work en français. Other countries still want to look at Canada because we have 2 official languages, because we have, linguistic duality and policies. Yeah, that's great. Say, come on in. And by the way, while you're here, can we look at what you're doing?
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to, I think it would be real, we don't need to. I think it would be really interesting to start saying, bon, le projet de l'immersion française, là, ça date quand même de 54 ans à peu près au Canada. Hein? Et donc, un peu avant, là, si on compte 63, là, cette première école à Montréal, peu importe. On va donner 60 ans, OK? Just for the fun of it. Mais depuis 60 ans, est-ce que nous sommes toujours à l'avant? Have we kind of like balanced out what's happening in other countries? The bilingual education in the States was so far behind, but then there are other countries that saw, oh, bilingual education, like, let's do that. Picked it up and did really cool stuff with it, right? So I think to frame our particular context, but at the same time have that outward look for our research, I think massively important, so that we can say, can we still have this amazing thing called French language education in Canada that is unique to Canada, but that also takes a look at the other things that are happening. And I know we have researchers who are doing this. I'm not saying that it isn't being done.
No.
But you're asking me about where do I think priorities could be? And I think some of these ways that we could have for researchers to position the great things that we're doing right alongside the great things that other jurisdictions are doing, so that between us, we can start saying, okay, so where are these little, and then please, please, please be healthy to one another. And let's think also about what we don't need to do anymore.
Can you give me an
Maybe we need
example?
some research on what we don't need to do anymore. This culture of like, let's just add on, not sustainable.
That's a pretty good segue, hopefully. Thank you, Lace. I am taking notes for the purposes of leading these exchanges, but I have a couple of nuggets there that I'm definitely going to reflect on myself. Je sais pas si Maïka, tu as quelque chose à ajouter, à poser avant qu'on lance au groupe?
J'ai plusieurs questions, toutes sortes de questions, mais en fait, maintenant, je vais poser la dernière question. Je vais le mettre dans le chat pour tout le monde. J'invite à tout le monde d'écrire leurs questions, leurs commentaires dans le chat et on va peut-être ouvrir la question à tout le monde. Oui.
Oui, surtout par rapport aux questions que les chercheurs, chercheuses devraient se poser ou poser aux autres. Yeah, and again, it can be contributions in the discussion can be in relation to something that you thought of for a long time, like I said earlier, or something that provoked a reflection related to the discussion we have just had.
As people are mulling things over, maybe I'll come back to something you said, and it's that idea of partnership, of coming together. For us on the West Coast in BC, we have a really good relationship with the ministry, actually, the French programs, and that's been developing over the years. I think it is around the issue of advocacy, because we do need to be advocates. And one of the things that I'm really thrilled about is every 6 months the ministry invites us as formateurs, formatrices, the teacher education folks, to a meeting with other stakeholders. And these are organizations looking at immigration, that fourth pathway that has come about, that has come about now as part of the agenda for recruitment and retention. There are people who are looking at the workplace. There are people who are looking at how to articulate across programs between the K-12 system to university into the workplace. So there are, and obviously different universities are there. Last time they even invited somebody from the University of Alberta to present something. So it's that kind of collegiality, this kind of exchange of ideas that lets us come out of our sort of silos and the issues that we're directly concerned with when it comes to FSL education and teachers, and to connect to some of the other perspectives and initiatives that are out there. And it just makes me think again how advocacy and support building really relies on a critical mass, right? The more you can connect, especially out west, where we're always so far away from the way things, the mass of French, if you want to call it that, in Canada. So that's really, really important, building our communities in that way. So yeah, and yet I don't think we've looked in terms of research. I don't think we've looked at that sort of building of these relationships across different, really very different groups of stakeholders. I see.
May I jump off of that? Annie Dillard says if you hoard your best ideas, you get ashes. When you open up the chest, there's ashes. And so had I not taken the admin path, my next research project in Little Regina, Saskatchewan was going to be, where are they now? And I say this because what you're saying about the network and who are the people and who are the stakeholders and where are our partners. Ever want to have fun? Google the number of people who work at Farm Credit Corporation who hold a baccalauréat en éducation française de l'Université de Regina. This is like super fun. So here's the provocative, le constat provocateur. Here is the provocative research statement. What if initial teacher education is only preparing people for a 5-year career? And if we think of initial teacher education en français, pour l'enseignement en français, if we think of initial teacher education as something that's only preparing people for a 5-year career, how will we as researchers shift the values we have within initial teacher education around being curriculum developers, around being administrators and leaders, okay? Because as soon as you speak French, you're going to end up in a leadership position. So it's almost guaranteed. Look at the screen. How many, leaders, the chef de département, associate deans, administrateur, administratrice we have on this, just on this little screen here today. So that's the provocative question, I think. How would we shift what we're doing in teacher education if we thought this amazing graduate that we're going to produce, who has a passion for French, who has a passion for teaching and learning, is probably going to do this job for 5 to 7 years? We always think of it as there's so much, we have such an attrition problem. But what if we don't? What if the new gig is 5 to 7 years of teaching? And how would that impact, and then Danielle has her hand up. This is great. How would that impact what we think about initial teacher education and what we think about resourcing teachers in a French language classroom, recognizing that they don't have time to translate something, they're only going to use it twice more because it's going to change, and then 6 years from now they're working for Farm Credit Corp, and making fabulous bilingual contributions. Danielle. Stéphanie, je te laisse gérer ça.
Oh, vas-y, Danielle. Moi,
Thank
je
you.
reflète.
Lisa Marie, I really appreciated your talk. My camera was off, but you would have seen me. There's a lot of head nodding going on. Things that really stuck out to me was talking about losing the ground of those who came before us, and what we can do really to ensure that we're going in directions that make us better. Your mention about the connection between language education and human rights, and that it's not a competition, but it is an and of course, you know, I do a lot of work related to the CFR and understanding that that's produced by Europe's leading human rights organization, right? This is a question of human rights. I also think as researchers, and I'm new at this, I'm in my second year of my PhD. I think also looking at the ecological nature of the system, and the example that really jumps out to me is when you mentioned about teacher education programs in French don't break even, and that being the piece that's looked at. When we brought in the question and try to understand why that is, we see many things that are contributing to this. Like, for example, and I've mentioned this lots of times, challenges around money for French as a second language not being enveloped. And while on paper, it looks that, you know, these transfers are happening and this is great, but when you dig deeper, you can see that when you follow the money, there are challenges that are there that really haven't been, I'm not convinced, fully uncovered. You mentioned Canadian Parents for French. They have, this is up on their website. You can see their arguments about enveloping. But that's what kind of resonated with me, is thinking about that ecological nature and the role that everybody coming together with a stronger voice for advocacy, that hopefully we can shift the path that we seem to be on that is quite alarming.
Mon micro est fermé.
Oui. J'ai vu. Merci. I see the comment from PEI that we often overvalue immersion. My apologies. I was an immersion teacher, so it's my go-to example. I think I want to bounce off this idea, Danielle, of the ecologies. And so what kind of ecologies of linguism? I don't want to limit it to bilingualism. So what ecologies of linguism, multilingualism, comment on veut le dire, might we look at creating, or might we look at valuing in ways that shift that conversation about the envelope, right, to something else? Many years ago, I had an exchange with a colleague, an American colleague, and I'd found something, we were researching together, and I'd found something that was, Hélène Sixou avait écrit quelque chose. I was just so on point. And I fired off an email in the middle of the night. I said, "Do you read French?" I said, "Do you speak French? You read French?" And he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." He said, I'm only unilingual. And he said, "And I find it debilitating." And I wrote back and said, "I'm only bilingual and I'm barely getting by." And what if we could have these bigger conversations about, and I think there's a really brilliant opportunity right now, given the sort of immigration explosion mutation that we're having in Canada right now. We are encountering so many people in our day-to-day lives now who are so lingual. They're so ex-lingual. It's wonderful. And how is that not being valued? And here's a research question. Where are we positioning the importance of listening? If I could change one thing about majority language arts, whatever we're calling it these days, if I could change one thing about the majority teaching in P12 education in unilingual Anglophone contexts, it would be to completely alter how we teach listening. Because I've done this little anecdotal experiment, and I'm going on a little tangent here. We see another question in the chat. I'll stop my tangent.
Yeah.
But I'll invite you all to think about this the next time that you go get a Tim Hortons. And I bet you've stood in line at Tim Hortons. And I hope it wasn't you as the person in front of you. I'm sure it was, because you're all lingual. And the person in front of you was very impatient with the person at Tim Hortons who was working there. And there was a breakdown of communication. And the majority person would say, well, that person isn't speaking English to me. They're not speaking in English to me that I understand. Okay. And almost exclusively when I observe these conversations is that the unilingual English speaker wasn't listening. So how might we emphasize listening? La sollicitude de l'écoute.
And not just the skill, but like not intercultural competence. I might be taking it too far, but this idea of what you hear might be something different than what you're used to.
Correct. But just narrowing it to say, est-ce qu'il y a une sollicitude de l'écoute?
Ouais.
I just came up with that. Okay, there's a new question, so I'll be quiet.
Yes, there is. Mark is around, or did he? Oh, he's right there. Was asking about FSL resources that become more reflective of our diverse population. However, in French, we still cannot be as representative of our resources as we are in English. I'm curious if researchers are investigating which students are staying in FSL programs, and if those students leave FSL are underrepresented in those resources.
That's a good one. I was thinking about the resources today, and I was looking around at a few things. And so, with it, puisque c'est le mois du patrimoine africain ici en Nouvelle-Écosse, et qu'on a fait beaucoup d'activités au cours du mois autour de cette thématique qu'on devrait faire à l'année longue, en passant, j'ai pensé, okay, let me just have a quick look. I'm just going to quickly look at I'm going to faire comme si j'étais enseignante de 4e année, dans le bon vieux temps, et voir si j'étais enseignante de 4e année, est-ce que ça serait facile pour moi? J'essaie de me mettre dans la peau de certaines des répondants dans votre étude, et je suis allée sur le site, et les deux liens qui disaient en français, j'ai cliqué, ça n'a rien à voir. One went to an English page, and the other one was like, this is the French Language Services branch in Nova Scotia. This is what we do. En anglais, by the way, but it described that. Alors, aussitôt que j'ai cliqué du contenu très important du patrimoine africain ici en Nouvelle-Écosse, aussitôt que j'ai cliqué pour avoir la moindre chose en français, à l'exception de la fiche qui est disponible en français, plus rien, comme diraient les cowboys fringants, plus rien. So I think that's a political pressure that I think, along with the people staying, this is a fabulous, who's staying? Again, we're flipping the question, right? A lot of times we do that negative thing. My acupuncturist will be so proud of me today. We do that negative thing to say who's leaving. But what if we flip it and say who's staying? What if we don't say, oh, gee, they're leaving the teaching profession, but are they, let's talk about while they're here. Who's staying in our French language programs? Who's coming to university bilingually or more than bilingually and not being able to access French offerings at their university?
Yeah, and I in my own brief research on student motivation, asked that question because I was feeling pressure from superintendents, sort of school boards, of saying, it's like a restaurant. You don't want to know who left, you want to know who came back. And so I see that. It's just, I felt compelled that there's still, I feel like the reasons will tell two different stories, but I think you're right in that one story is being told maybe more than another in terms of the staying. And I like that reframe of the question to get more input on that. I don't know how to do both at once. Voilà. I see a hand. I also wanted to just loop back at some point to Lana's question about, I know you mentioned it, Lace, about core French and immersion. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm going to think about it a little more as we go. We still have a little bit of time. Marie, did you want to ask your question? Sorry, Lizzie.
Okay. What I'm surprised by is that you didn't find resources with the Ministry of Education in Nova Scotia in French. J'étais enseignante en Nouvelle-Écosse et Jackie Gaillette avait plein de trousses sur les Acadiens et plein de ressources en français. Alors, je ne sais pas si ça a disparu, mais si c'est le cas, c'est vraiment... ce n'est pas encourageant, en tout cas. Alors, je ne sais pas ce qui se passe. But we had a lot of resources, and I find in Ontario, I have much fewer resources. And I also find I'm very isolated. And it's only because I have qualifications and I'm looking out for myself and for my students that I manage to handle things. But I think you have the right perspective overall on what's going on. Thank you.
Yeah, and we do have a lot of resources en Nouvelle-Écosse. C'est pas ça que j'essayais de dire. J'essaie tout simplement de me mettre dans la peau de quelqu'un qui est très occupé, qui enseigne un groupe de jeunes et qui essaie de mettre en évidence la thématique du mois du patrimoine africain. Et si cette personne qui a 24 ans et 30 élèves dans sa classe et et qui essaie de trouver des ressources comme ça sur le vif. Et on arrive sur le site web et évidemment, les jeunes, ils vont parcourir le site web. Hein. Et puis, si c'est pas là, ben, c'est pas là. Et là, on arrive au point de dire, comme vous avez trouvé dans la recherche, il y a des ressources matérielles qui sont lacunaires.
One thing I wanted to add before going to Daniel's point, and maybe hear Lisa's reaction, is that, and maybe I've said this already, I find one of the research questions, or a question I'd like to know, is around kind of like the why are they staying? What resources are being used? Because I don't think it's a question of that there's no material resources out there. It's what is being adopted. It kind of reminds me of the discussions of tech integration, right? There's all this technology and some of it is being used more often than others. So why is that? What does it just fit well in FSL, or is there what other things are happening? It kind of reminds me of that. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Danielle, est-ce que vous pouvez patienter un instant? So I think that there was some niggles about this question in your research, Stephanie, because I do think there are resources out there. But then there were also people talked a lot about having to translate, or the resources weren't at the right level. And I think one of the elephants in the room that we're not connecting to this resource question is la confiance linguistique des enseignants. I didn't say insécurité linguistique. I did that on purpose. I'm trying to flip it to the positive. So, la confiance langagière de notre corps enseignant. Because if, as a teacher, I read a book from France and it has some vocabulary that I don't understand, even if it's for like a grade 3 person, little grade 3 human, like my niece would read it in Lyon, and I don't get this vocabulaire, then I might hesitate. Je vais peut-être hésiter avant d'utiliser ça dans ma salle de classe, ou j'ai peut-être pas le temps pour faire mes propres recherches pour être confortable ou confiante avec le vocabulaire. And then we say, well, I don't have as many resources. So est-ce qu'on est en train d'outiller les enseignants de formation et aussi les enseignants en service? Est-ce qu'on va les outiller comme il faut pour pouvoir interagir avec les ressources matérielles qui existent déjà? But I love your question about which resources are we using? Which ones
and
get
why?
taken
But
up?
that would factor back to that in terms of reasons why you use these and not others, if you're aware of them or not, right? I think that first layer, or first survol, is really the awareness of what's out there. And once they're aware, and it's not that they have to, but it's just a question.
Thanks for waiting.
Yeah, Danielle, busy.
I just wanted to comment on the message that was put in the chat around attrition or the reasons why people stay. And a piece that I wanted to highlight that I think as researchers would be interesting for us to look at, because oftentimes we'll get the raw data from a school board or a school board report, for example, but questioning whether or not that's actually a longitudinal study of tracing actual learners from beginning to end, or is this just raw numbers? Because we see a lot of moving in and out of English. And that needs to be factored in, because sometimes the data may tell a story that's not necessarily accurate for a context. And I don't know, it'd be interesting to know if there has been an actual longitudinal, not just raw numbers, but actually tracing people to see what that path looks like.
I'm not aware of, but
I'm not aware. I'm trying to think of the funding agency that we tap into to do that longitudinal study. But in the absence of that, I do think that there'd be some interesting opportunities. Thanks for joining us, Mimi. Merci. I think there'd be some interesting opportunities of doing some retrospectives around graduates of FSL. How did they perceive that it assisted them? When did it come back into being? And a lot of times the governments, they like to do these graduate surveys, So when the students graduate from when they graduate from high school, when they graduate from university, it's all very sort of market driven. And they don't always think, well, like I said, French immersion is 60 years old. So there are 45-year-olds out there who are graduates of immersion. Ah, voilà, tant mieux. And so interview yourself, do an autoethnography. But we could go and find some of those graduates of varying ages and those people and say, just like a snowball sample and say, did you go to immersion? Do you value it? And if they say yes to those two questions, and set up our research thing and find out why. What did it give them? I can see positive stories just des gens de mon réseau là. où je vois que ça a fait une différence. Et aussi la tristesse que l'autre jour, mon fils ne voulait pas parler en français à 25 ans. I'm like, well, wait a minute. I'm sending you go ski with your auntie in France because this is unacceptable,
Oui.
right?
Non, c'est une bonne question. Sorry.
I
Micah,
just
go
wanted
ahead.
to go back to and I don't know, the question that was in
Mark.
okay, yeah. I mean, the first part of that, the discussion around diversity and the, I guess, lack of, I mean, there's work being done now, of course, and Mimi just left. She's somebody
that's who I thought of immediately.
doing a lot of work in this and the development of curriculum that actually speaks to who is in our classrooms today. But it made me think of something that that I encountered with my class of FSL teachers in our master's program last weekend. When we talked about authentic text, the use of texts in our teaching, and you know, the usual challenges of finding a text that is appropriate to the levels of the students, but also engages them, etc. And so AI came up, of course. Can I produce a text? You know, and I can, you know, play with the prompts, and I can maybe, and so that just, I mean, that's an area that opens up a whole new domain of questions around resource development, but also the kinds of resources that we, you know, that might be produced, who they speak to, because of course these resources will be drawing on what exists currently. So anyways, I just wanted to kind of throw that out there like a frisbee that doesn't land and who might be catching it. So, but just to say, our world is changing so quickly, and there's so many things that are coming at us, and how do we, like you said, Lace, capitalize on that to some extent, by turning the questions around, as you did, and just to being open to what's happening there. So I see that as a leitmotif actually today, and I think it connects nicely to the listening too. So anyways.
May I say one other thing, given the areas of the crowd? If you're doing research, we have a PhD student. If you're doing research, bug someone you think might have money to support it. And that includes like the deans. Like, just bug them, and you know, don't pester them, but ask them. Just ask for a meeting, and they'll say they don't have any money, and they don't. Except the deans know sometimes who has money, and so if you're a faculty member who hasn't talked to your dean in a while about this, or if you're lucky enough to have a VP Francophone Affairs or somebody like that, go bug them. Because, you know, a lot of times the people with the money need the champions too. And so I would just say, you know, look for those allies who might not have what you need, but might be able to put in touch with the person that you need.
May I extend that to the notion that it's not just faculty members who are researchers? If there's teachers out there with, I mean, practicing teachers are theorists, they're researchers. I would echo that and say they might not always have the money, but they might know where to look. I know CASLT did some work with supporting action research done in classrooms, and there's certainly these kind of questions can be addressed.
And university researchers in faculties of education are looking for teachers who are also interested in research. It's massively important. And in the current funding scheme, that's research that's getting funded. It's not just the SSHRC Partnership Engagement Grant, but we have a whole system in Nova Scotia that's grounded in university researchers working with teachers and school-based researchers to come up with interesting ideas and research concepts, and doing the research in their classrooms to try to look for interesting solutions. So, and look at this, teachers doing research, $1,000 a year. If you're in Saskatchewan, there's the Sterling McDowell. Just go apply for the money. They will give it to you. Right. So yeah, please. Yeah, it would just encourage all of us to, you know, just as I bug my provost, and I'm not asking you to do something that I don't do, and this is going to be in the web, she'll hear it, but I also advocate to whoever else I can get a hold of. Do you have money? Can we cobble together this money to do this initiative? I think we need to keep asking
it's like another resource. The third resource that we're talking about in this gap is human.
Exactly.
That's what I'm getting the sense of. And
capital.
Yeah, it kind of comes back to, I think, the other gaps as well. One thing I wanted to just throw out there, just as a caveat as well, to Lana's comment that resonates with me around immersion and core French. I mean, everybody in this room is definitely advocates for basic French courses, core French, and the fact that the majority of FSL learners in our classrooms are in those programs. So there's promotion that continues and needs to continue around that. In teacher education, it's definitely something I've been wanting to ask this because I'm starting to see it more and more, not only the funding mechanism and what is funded because of the shortage of teachers in immersion, there's definitely, it comes down and you need to be preparing French immersion teachers, and core French is typically forgotten. I think what in my experience is interesting is there may be promotion, but there's, in terms of the human resource, and oh my goodness, I'm forgetting her name from McGill right now. Folks who've done work around what does teacher education for immersion look like, because it's typically an add-on course. It's not part of the fundamental. So in fact, a lot of the teacher education programs in Canada do prepare for FSL broadly, but student teachers, in my experience, are interested in going into an immersion context because of the need. So I think it's a complex question. I just wanted to acknowledge, because I don't know to what extent it's as much a promotion as it is as well, this idea of belief systems and where the need is.
And if you are in BC, if you are in the Maritimes, if you're in Saskatchewan, if you are in parts of Alberta, then if you're in Newfoundland, all of these jurisdictions have small Francophone populations from a percentage of the population point of view. And I think we also have opportunities, I think, to do research alongside, in collaboration with our colleagues who are looking at FLA, Français langue première contexts. I do think that there's an opportunity there. And I've said to anyone at the ministry who will listen, that we will not solve the FL1 teaching shortage if we don't also address the immersion shortage, and we will not solve the immersion teacher shortage and core French shortage if we don't solve the FL1, because we end up cannibalizing from ourselves, right? And so I think there's something interesting to be done there too. If any policy researchers are out there or who listen to this after, to say, you know, what are the policies that are impacting the ways that I don't like this word, but so I'll use a different one. The ways that we create and fill teaching assignments, both within, say, a board or Regional Center for Education here in Nova Scotia, or in across jurisdictions when you have this oversight body of provincial government.
Very creative. I like that. I'm cognizant of the time, and Lace, if you don't have any other final comments, I think that's a good one to sort of end on, this idea of creative thinking and questioning ourselves, but also bringing other people into the fore to have these hard discussions. C'est ce que j'ai retenu, de plusieurs points que j'ai retenu de la discussion. I want to thank everybody for coming, for attending. We have one more exchange scheduled for May, and it's one related to individual and relational approaches to FSL education, teacher education, with Sarah Mercer coming to us from the University of Graz. So that should be very great time to discuss. And they all link together. I mean, we've had 3 wonderful exchanges, and this one pushes our thinking even further. So thank you énormément. Merci, Lace.
Merci pour l'invitation.
Oui, merci pour la participation. Merci à tout le monde pour le temps, effort, énergie que vous avez attribué à cette session.